So long that he's forgotten the sound of laughter around his dinner table. Fate has a way of changing everything in a single moment. Ezra Stone lives deep in the Colorado mountains, far from town and the troubles that come with people. He's made a good life trapping and hunting, keeping to himself through 15 hard winters. But when he finds two young sisters nearly frozen to death in the snow, everything changes. The girls are orphans with nowhere to go. Ezra brings them to his cabin, feeds them, and nurses them back to health. As the weeks pass and spring draws near, both sisters begin to see their quiet rescuer as more than just a kind stranger. Now this simple mountain man faces his biggest challenge yet. What happens when both sisters decide their gruff savior is the man they want to marry? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain had taught Ezra Stone many things over the years, but perhaps the most important lesson was this: solitude was both a blessing and a curse. At first light each morning, he would rise from his narrow bed and step outside his cabin to greet the day with the same ritual he had performed for 15 winters. The air would bite at his weathered cheeks, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and snow and something else, something that spoke of endless space and freedom from the complications of civilized life. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of towering evergreens, positioned just right to catch the morning sun while staying protected from the worst of the winter winds. It was a solid structure, built with his own hands from logs he had felled and shaped with care. The walls were chinked tight against the cold, the roof steep enough to shed snow, and the stone chimney drew smoke cleanly from the hearth that served as both cooking fire and the heart of his simple home. Inside, everything had its place. The main room held a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, though he had rarely needed the second one, along with shelves lined with supplies, tools, and the few books he had brought with him when he first climbed into these mountains. A small bedroom barely large enough for his bed and a trunk occupied one corner, while the other corner held his winter gear and the tools of his trade, traps, skinning knives, and the rifle that had kept him fed and protected all these years. But it was the mantelpiece above the fireplace that told the real story of Ezra Stone. There, carved from pine and weathered smooth by his own hands, stood 3 small crosses. No names adorned them. He had no need for names to remember who they represented. His wife Mary, his son Thomas, his daughter little Sarah, barely 5 years old when the fever took her. The crosses had been with him since the beginning, since the day he had loaded his few possessions onto a pack mule and headed up into the high country to escape the weight of an empty house and a town full of pitying looks. He had been 32 then, a man who thought he knew what life would bring him. Now at 47, he understood that life had its own plans, and those plans rarely matched what a man expected. The mountain had been good to him, though. It demanded honesty. There was no room for pretense when your survival depended on your skills and judgment. It rewarded hard work and punished laziness with equal measure. Most importantly, it asked nothing of him that he could not give. Unlike the world of towns and neighbors and social obligations, the mountain simply was. It existed, it endured, and it allowed a man to do the same if he proved himself worthy. His days followed a pattern that varied little with the seasons. In winter, he would check his trap lines, following routes he had established over the years through the forest. He knew every game trail, every stream crossing, every place where the animals would shelter from storms. The work was hard but satisfying. It required skill, patience, and a deep understanding of the land and its creatures. Spring meant different work, planting a small garden behind the cabin, repairing any damage the winter had done to his buildings and equipment, preparing for the summer months when he would hunt and fish and gather what the mountain offered. Summer brought its own rhythm, long days of hiking and hunting, the work of preserving meat and gathering berries and medicinal plants. The satisfaction of watching his garden produce the vegetables that would help sustain him through another winter. Fall was perhaps his favorite time. The aspen leaves would turn gold against the dark green of the pine and spruce, and the air would carry a crispness that spoke of the coming cold. It was a time of preparation, of making ready for the long months ahead. But it was also a time when the mountain showed its gentler face, when the harsh edges of winter were still softened by memory, and the brutal heat of summer was cooling into something pleasant. He had grown into this life slowly, like a plant finding its place in rocky soil. The first few years had been the hardest. Not because of the physical challenges. He had been a strong man even then, capable of the work the mountain demanded. The difficulty had been in the silence. After years of coming home to Mary's voice calling his name, to the sound of children's laughter echoing through the house, to the constant pleasant noise of family life, the silence of the mountain had felt crushing. But gradually, he had learned to hear the mountain's own voices. The wind in the pines sang differently in each season. The creek that ran past his cabin spoke in varying tones as it moved from the full rush of spring snowmelt to the quiet whisper of late summer. Even the silence had its own quality. The deep, absolute quiet of a snow-heavy night was different from the expectant hush that preceded a storm. The loneliness had been harder to overcome. There were times, especially in the deep of winter, when weeks might pass without him speaking aloud, except to curse a stubborn trap or thank the mountain for a successful hunt. When he would find himself talking to Mary, as if she were still beside him. He would tell her about his day, ask her opinion on whether to move a trap line or how long the winter might last. Sometimes he could almost hear her laugh, or feel her hand on his shoulder as she leaned over to see what he was cooking for supper. Those moments were both comfort and torment. They reminded him of what he had lost, but they also kept alive the part of him that remembered how to love, how to care for someone beyond himself. He had never been sure whether holding on to those feelings was wise or foolish, but he'd been unable to let them go entirely. The years had changed him, of course. His hair had gone grey at the temples, and his face had gained the deep lines that came from squinting against snow glare and mountain sun. His body had grown harder and more spare, shaped by the constant physical demands of his life. But perhaps more importantly, he had learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. Most days now, the solitude felt like a choice rather than a burden. He had his routines, his small pleasures, the satisfaction of a well-maintained trapline, the taste of fresh trout cooked over an open fire, the sight of elk moving through the meadow below his cabin in the early morning light, the deep, dreamless sleep that came after a day of honest work in clean air. These things had become enough, or very nearly enough. The town of Cedar Ridge lay 2 days' hard travel down the mountain, and Ezra made the journey perhaps 4 times a year. He would bring his furs and hides to trade for the few things he could not provide for himself: coffee, ammunition, salt, and other necessities. The townspeople knew him by reputation, if not by familiarity. The hermit who lived up in the high country, who minded his own business and expected others to mind theirs. He had never lingered in town longer than necessary. The noise and bustle that other people seemed to thrive on felt overwhelming after the quiet of the mountain. But more than that, he could see in people's faces a mixture of curiosity and pity that made him uncomfortable. They wondered about the man who chose to live alone in the wilderness, and their wondering felt like an intrusion into something private and carefully maintained. So he would conduct his business quickly and quietly, speaking only when spoken to, being polite but not encouraging conversation. Then he would load his supplies and head back up the mountain, usually feeling a sense of relief when the last sounds of civilization faded behind him and he was once again surrounded by nothing but forest and sky. This pattern had sustained him for 15 years. 15 winters of solitude, 15 springs of quiet preparation, 15 summers of unhurried work, 15 autumns of golden contentment. He had grown comfortable with his life, settled into it like a man settling into a favorite chair by the fire. But now, as he stood in the doorway of his cabin on this particular winter morning, something felt different. The air carried a quality he could not quite name, a sense of change coming, like the feeling that preceded a storm, but subtler, more personal. He had learned to trust such instincts over the years. The mountain had taught him that survival often depended on noticing the small signs that others might miss. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, shouldered his pack, and picked up his rifle. The trapline would not check itself, and whatever change might be coming, his responsibilities remained the same. But as he stepped out into the snow and began following the familiar path into the forest, Ezra Stone could not shake the feeling that this day would be different from the thousands that had come before it. The mountain, as always, kept its secrets. But sometimes, just sometimes, it was ready to share them with a man who had proven himself worthy of trust. The storm had been building for 3 days, and Ezra could feel it in his bones as he made his way along the trapline. The wind carried that particular bite that promised serious snow, the kind that could bury a man's cabin and keep him trapped inside for a week or more. He had seen storms like this before, and he knew enough to get home and batten down before the worst of it arrived. But it was the sound that made him stop, a sound that had no place in the winter wilderness. At first, he thought it might be an animal, perhaps a wounded deer crying out in distress. But as he stood still and listened, the wind carrying the sound more clearly to his ears, he realized it was something else entirely. It was human voices, weak and desperate, calling out in the growing storm. Ezra's first instinct was to turn away. Human troubles were exactly what he had come to the mountain to escape. But the voices carried a quality that tugged at something deep in his chest. Fear and desperation, yes, but also youth. These were not the voices of experienced travelers who had simply underestimated the weather. These sounded like children. He followed the sound through the thickening snow, his rifle ready, but his heart beginning to race for reasons that had nothing to do with potential danger. The voices grew clearer as he approached, and he could make out words now, please and help and so cold. They were definitely young, definitely female, and definitely in serious trouble. He found them huddled together beneath a crude lean-to made from pine branches, barely visible through the falling snow. 2 young women, wrapped in what had once been traveling clothes, but were now little more than frozen rags. They were pressed against each other for warmth, shivering violently, their lips blue with cold. One of them held something clutched against her chest, a small, raggedy doll that looked as though it had seen better days. The older of the 2 looked up as Ezra approached, and he saw intelligence in her eyes despite her condition. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with dark hair matted with snow and ice. The younger one appeared to be barely out of her teens, with lighter hair and features that spoke of gentleness rather than the harder edge he saw in her sister. "Please," the older one said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My sister, she's so cold. I don't think she can last much longer." Ezra knelt beside them, his experienced eye taking in their condition quickly. They were both suffering from exposure, but the younger one was clearly in worse shape. Her shivering had taken on the irregular pattern that meant her body was beginning to shut down. If he did not get them warm soon, she would not survive the night. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, already shrugging out of his heavy coat to wrap around the younger girl. 2 days, the older sister replied. "Maybe 3. I've lost track. We ran out of food yesterday, and our fire went out during the night. I couldn't get it started again." As he lifted the younger sister, Ezra was shocked by how light she was, far too light for a healthy young woman. These girls had been on short rations for longer than just a few days. The raggedy doll fell from her grasp, and the older sister quickly retrieved it, clutching it as though it were precious beyond measure. "What are you doing up here?" Ezra asked, as he cradled the unconscious girl against his chest. "This is no place for travelers, especially not in winter." The older sister's eyes flickered with something, fear perhaps or wariness. "We're orphans," she said simply. "We had nowhere else to go." It was not the whole truth Ezra could tell, but it was all she was prepared to share with a stranger. And truthfully, it did not matter right now. What mattered was getting them both to warmth and safety before the storm claimed them entirely. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, though he could see the effort it cost her to struggle to her feet. "How far?" "About a mile," Ezra replied. "My cabin's not far, but you'll need to keep up. This storm's getting worse, and I can't carry you both." The journey back to his cabin was the longest mile of Ezra's life. The older sister, she had told him her name was Sarah, proved to have more strength than her appearance suggested, but the snow was deepening rapidly, and the wind was picking up. More than once he thought she might collapse, but each time she found the will to keep moving. The younger sister, Emma, Sarah had whispered, remained unconscious throughout the journey, her breathing shallow and irregular. Ezra found himself talking to her as he carried her, the same way he sometimes talked to Mary when the loneliness grew too heavy. "Stay with us," he murmured. "Just a little farther. You're going to be all right." When they finally reached the cabin, Ezra's relief was overwhelming. He shouldered open the door and carried Emma straight to the fireplace, laying her down on the rug before the hearth. Sarah collapsed into one of the chairs, too exhausted to do anything but watch as Ezra built up the fire and began the work of saving her sister's life. He had dealt with frostbite and exposure before. The mountain was unforgiving to the unprepared. He knew the process. Gradual warming, careful attention to breathing and circulation, hot broth when they were able to swallow. But he had never worked so hard to save a life, never felt so invested in the outcome. As the cabin warmed and Emma's breathing grew stronger, Ezra found himself studying the two sisters. They were clearly related. There was a similarity in the shape of their faces, the way they held themselves. But where Sarah carried herself with a kind of defensive wariness, Emma seemed softer, more trusting even in unconsciousness. "She's always been the gentle one," Sarah said quietly, as though reading his thoughts. "Too gentle for this world, perhaps. Our parents used to say she saw the good in everyone, even when there wasn't much good to see." "What happened to your parents?" Ezra asked, settling a blanket more securely around Emma. Sarah's face closed off again. "Fever took them last spring. We've been on our own since then." Again, Ezra sensed there was more to the story, but he did not press. These girls had secrets, and given their condition and their presence in his mountains, those secrets were likely dangerous ones. But for now, it was enough that they were alive and warming. As the night wore on and the storm raged outside, Emma began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked around the cabin with confusion before her gaze settled on Ezra. Instead of fear, he saw gratitude in her expression. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Something shifted in Ezra's chest at those words, something he had thought was safely buried under 15 years of solitude. It was the feeling of being needed, of mattering to another human being. He had forgotten how powerful that could be. "Rest now," he said gently. "You're safe." But even as he said the words, Ezra wondered if they were true. These girls had brought something into his carefully ordered world, not just their presence, but their troubles, whatever those might be. As he settled into his chair to keep watch through the night, the raggedy doll that Sarah still clutched serving as a reminder of innocence lost, he realized that his life of solitude had just become infinitely more complicated. The mountain had kept its secrets for 15 years. Now it had delivered him 2 young women who carried secrets of their own. And Ezra Stone was no longer sure whether he was their salvation or they were his. 3 days passed before Emma was strong enough to sit up for more than a few minutes at a time. During those days, Ezra's cabin became a different place entirely, no longer the domain of a solitary man, but something approaching a home with a family in it. The transformation both comforted and unsettled him in equal measure. Sarah proved to be a capable nurse, tending to her sister with a mixture of gentle care and fierce protectiveness that reminded Ezra of a mother wolf guarding her cubs. She rarely left Emma's side except when necessity demanded it, and even then she kept one eye on her sister's sleeping form. It was clear that protecting Emma had become the driving force of her life. On the 4th morning, as Emma sat propped against the pillows Ezra had fashioned for her, Sarah finally showed him what she had been guarding so carefully, a faded photograph tucked inside the Raggedy Doll's dress. The image was creased and worn, but it clearly showed the two sisters as younger children, standing beside a well-dressed couple in front of what appeared to be a prosperous farm. "Our parents," Sarah said simply, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph with reverence. "This and Emma's doll are all we have left of our old life." Ezra studied the image, noting the quality of the clothing, the substantial house visible in the background, the general air of prosperity that surrounded the family. These girls had not always been orphaned wanderers. They had come from something much better than their current circumstances suggested. "You had a good life," he observed. "We did," Emma spoke up, her voice stronger now, though still soft. "Papa owned one of the largest farms in the county. Mama taught us to read and write, to keep house properly. Sarah was learning to manage the farm accounts." Her face grew sad. "We thought it would last forever." "Nothing lasts forever," Sarah said, with a bitterness that seemed too old for her years. "We learned that the hard way over the following days, as Emma's strength returned and both sisters began to settle into the rhythm of life in the cabin. Ezra found himself learning more about his unexpected guests. Sarah was indeed 22, with a quick mind and a talent for practical matters that had served them well during their months of wandering. She could cook with whatever ingredients were available, mend clothing with scraps of fabric, and had an uncanny ability to stretch supplies far beyond what seemed possible. Emma, at 19, possessed a gentler nature but was far from helpless. She had a way with animals that amazed Ezra. His usually skittish mare would eat from her hand, and even the wild birds seemed drawn to her presence. More than that, she had an intuitive understanding of people that sometimes left him feeling as though she could see straight through to his soul. "You've been alone a long time," she said one evening as they sat before the fire. "Sarah having gone to bed early with a headache. I can see it in the way you move around the cabin, like you're not used to having to think about anyone else being here." Ezra looked up from the trap he was repairing, surprised by her directness. 15 years, he admitted. "That's a long time to carry grief alone," Emma said softly. He had not told them about Mary and the children, but somehow Emma had sensed the weight he carried. It should have made him uncomfortable, this young woman's ability to see so clearly. Instead, he found it oddly comforting. "Some things are easier to carry alone," he replied. "Maybe," Emma said, "but some things get lighter when they're shared." The conversation stayed with him long after Emma had retired to the small bedroom he had given over to the sisters. For 15 years, he had believed that his grief was something private, something that belonged only to him and his memories. The idea that it might be shared, that someone else might help him bear its weight, was both appealing and terrifying. As the days turned into a week, then 2, the cabin began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home with a family in it. Sarah proved to be an excellent cook, able to transform Ezra's simple supplies into meals that were not only nourishing, but genuinely enjoyable. Emma's presence seemed to brighten the space itself. She had a way of humming while she worked that filled the silence Ezra had grown so accustomed to, but it was the small intimacies of shared living that affected him most profoundly. The sound of quiet conversation between the sisters as they prepared for bed, the sight of Emma's dress hanging beside his clothes near the fire to dry, the way Sarah would automatically pour 3 cups of coffee in the morning instead of 1. These tiny changes to his routine should have felt like intrusions, but instead they felt like homecoming. The sisters, for their part, seemed to be settling in with a contentment that suggested they had found what they were looking for. Sarah's defensive wariness gradually gave way to something approaching trust, and Emma's natural warmth began to shine through as her health fully returned. They both took on household tasks without being asked, clearly wanting to contribute to their keep rather than simply being burdens. But Ezra was beginning to notice other changes as well, subtle shifts in the way both sisters looked at him, spoke to him, positioned themselves when he was near. Sarah, despite her initial wariness, had begun to seek out his opinion on small matters, asking his advice about cooking or whether the weather would hold. Emma had developed a habit of sitting closer to him in the evenings, close enough that he could catch the scent of her hair when she leaned forward to tend the fire. These small gestures might have meant nothing, or they might have meant everything. Ezra found himself uncertain how to interpret them, and even more uncertain how he felt about the possibilities they suggested. He was 47 years old, long settled into a life of solitude, and these were young women with their whole lives ahead of them. The idea that either of them might see him as anything more than a convenient protector seemed both unlikely and inappropriate, yet he could not deny that their presence had awakened something in him that he had thought permanently buried. The simple pleasure of cooking for others, of being needed, of having someone to talk to at the end of a long day. These things had been absent from his life for so long that he had convinced himself he no longer missed them. Now surrounded by the gentle bustle of a household with women in it, he realized how much he had given up when he chose solitude over the risk of further loss. The photograph of their parents remained propped on the mantelpiece beside his wooden crosses, a reminder of the lives these girls had lost and the family they had been part of. But increasingly, Ezra found himself wondering what kind of family they might become together, and whether a man who had spent 15 years learning to live alone could remember how to be part of something larger than himself. The morning Ezra decided to show the sisters his father's hunting knife marked a turning point in their relationship. It was not something he had planned. The knife had remained hidden in his trunk for 15 years, wrapped in oiled leather alongside the few other possessions that connected him to his life before the mountain. But something about the way Emma had asked about his family, her gentle curiosity combined with genuine respect for his privacy, had made him want to share this piece of his history. The knife was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, forged by his grandfather and passed down through 3 generations of stonemen. The blade was Damascus steel, folded and refolded until it showed the characteristic watered pattern that marked superior metalwork. The handle was carved from elk antler, worn smooth by decades of use, and the brass guard bore the initials JS for his father. Jacob Stone. It's beautiful, Emma breathed, as Ezra unwrapped it carefully on the kitchen table. The pattern in the steel, I've never seen anything like it. My grandfather made it, Ezra explained, running his thumb along the flat of the blade. He was a blacksmith back in Ohio before the family moved west. My father carried it through the war, and his father carried it before him. It was supposed to go to my son someday. The words came out more easily than he had expected, without the sharp pain that usually accompanied any mention of Thomas. Perhaps it was the understanding he saw in both sisters' faces, or perhaps it was simply time. 15 years of carrying grief alone had worn its edges smooth. Like a stone polished by running water, may I? Sarah asked, extending her hand. Ezra nodded, and she lifted the knife with the reverence it deserved, testing its weight and balance. You can tell it was made by someone who understood blades, she said. The balance is perfect. Her familiarity with weapons surprised him, though perhaps it should not have. 2 young women traveling alone would have needed some means of protection, and Sarah struck him as someone who would have ensured they were not entirely helpless. You know something about knives, he observed. Sarah's cheeks colored slightly. Our father taught us both to handle firearms and blades. He said the frontier was no place for helpless women, even on a prosperous farm. Sarah can put 3 shots in a playing card at 50 yards, Emma added, with obvious pride in her sister. This revelation added another layer to his understanding of the sisters. They were not simply helpless orphans who had stumbled into his mountains by accident. They had skills, knowledge, and capabilities that they had kept hidden during their first weeks in his cabin. The knowledge should have made him more wary, but instead it made him respect them more. As February gave way to March and the deep snows began to show the first signs of the coming thaw, Ezra found himself including the sisters more fully in his daily routines. He taught them to read the weather signs that warned of coming storms, showed them how to maintain the trap lines, and explained the seasonal patterns that governed life in the high country. Emma proved to have an intuitive understanding of the mountain's rhythms that surprised even Ezra. She could predict changes in weather hours before they arrived, and she seemed to understand the behavior of the local wildlife in ways that usually took years to develop. When he mentioned this, she blushed prettily and explained that she had always been able to sense things others missed. "Mama used to say I was touched by the sight," she said. "Nothing dramatic, just small knowings about weather and animals and such. Sarah's always been the practical one, but I seem to understand the natural world without having to think about it." Sarah, meanwhile, threw herself into learning the more technical aspects of mountain survival with an intensity that spoke of someone preparing for a long stay. She memorized the locations of natural landmarks, practiced with Ezra's rifle until her shooting rivaled his own, and peppered him with questions about everything from preserving meat to identifying edible plants. "You're planning to stay," Ezra observed one evening as he watched her carefully clean and oil his spare rifle. Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "If you'll have us. We have nowhere else to go, and this," she gestured around the cabin, "this feels like home in a way nowhere has since we lost our parents." "And what about Emma? Does she feel the same way?" "Why don't you ask her yourself?" Sarah replied with a small smile. The conversation with Emma came the next evening as they sat together on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. The air was still cold, but there was a quality to it that spoke of winter loosening its grip on the mountain. "Sarah says you're thinking of staying permanently," Ezra said without preamble. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her breath visible in small puffs as she considered her words. "Do you want us to leave?" she asked finally. "That's not what I asked." "No, but it's what you're really wondering about, isn't it? Whether we're imposing on your solitude, whether you're ready for your peaceful life to be disrupted indefinitely." Her perceptiveness continued to amaze him. "And what do you think the answer is?" Emma turned to look at him directly, and in her eyes he saw something that made his breath catch. It was not just gratitude or friendship, it was something deeper, warmer, more complicated. "I think you've been alone long enough," she said softly. "I think you're ready to be part of a family again, even if you don't quite believe it yet." "Emma, I know what you're going to say, that you're too old, that we're too young, that it wouldn't be proper or practical or any number of other sensible things. But some things aren't about being sensible. Sometimes they're about what the heart knows, even when the mind hasn't caught up yet." The conversation left Ezra deeply unsettled, not because Emma was wrong, but because she was so clearly right. Over the past weeks, he had begun to feel something he had not experienced since Mary's death, the stirring of romantic feelings, the desire not just for companionship, but for something deeper and more intimate. But it was not just Emma who inspired these feelings. Sarah, despite her more guarded nature, had begun to show him glimpses of a softer side that was equally appealing. The way she sang quietly while she worked, the fierce protectiveness she showed toward her sister, the quick intelligence that sparkled in her eyes when they discussed books or ideas, all of these things had begun to work their way into his consciousness. The realization that he was developing feelings for both sisters should have horrified him. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long sleep, like coming back to life after years of merely existing. But with that awakening came complications he was not sure he was prepared to face. As spring drew closer and the mountain began its annual transformation from winter's harsh beauty to something gentler and more welcoming, Ezra found himself wondering what kind of life they might build together, and whether it was possible for a man to love two women without destroying them all. The letter arrived with the first pack train of spring, carried by a grizzled trader named Murphy, who had been bringing supplies to the high country for longer than most men had been alive. Ezra had been expecting the usual delivery of coffee, ammunition, and other necessities. What he had not expected was for Murphy to pull a sealed envelope from his coat pocket and hand it over with a knowing look. "Found this posted at the trading post down in Cedar Ridge," Murphy said, studying Ezra's face carefully. "Figured it might be important, seeing as how nobody usually has call to write to you up here." The envelope was expensive paper, with writing that spoke of education and refinement. But it was the name written in the corner that made Ezra's blood run cold. From the estate of Margaret Whitmore, Denver, Colorado. Sarah, who had been helping to unload the pack train, went pale when she saw the envelope. Emma, standing beside her, reached out instinctively to steady her sister as Sarah swayed on her feet. "You know who this is from," Ezra said quietly, and it was not a question. Sarah nodded slowly. "Margaret Whitmore was our father's sister. She married well and moved to Denver before we were born. We've never met her, but," she swallowed hard, "she's our only living relative." Murphy, clearly sensing undercurrents he did not understand, quickly finished unloading his supplies and departed with more haste than usual. When his pack train had disappeared down the mountain trail, Ezra led the sisters inside and carefully opened the letter. The contents were worse than he had feared. Margaret Whitmore had indeed learned of her brother's death and the subsequent disappearance of his daughters. But rather than expressing concern for their welfare, the letter was filled with accusations and demands. She had hired investigators to track the sisters down, believing them to be in possession of certain valuables that had disappeared from their father's estate after his death. More troubling still, the letter contained details about the sisters' flight from their home that painted a very different picture than the simple story of orphaned girls seeking shelter. According to Margaret Whitmore, Sarah and Emma had fled in the night after being accused of theft, taking with them not only family heirlooms but also money belonging to their father's business partners. "Is this true?" Ezra asked quietly, looking from one sister to the other. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but it was Sarah who answered, her voice steady despite the strain visible in her face. "Not the way she tells it. Yes, we left in the night. Yes, we took some things with us. But they were ours by right. Family pieces that belonged to our mother, money that our father had set aside for our dowries. We didn't steal anything. Then why run? Why not stay and fight for what was rightfully yours?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Because Margaret Whitmore is wealthy and powerful, and we were two orphaned girls with no one to speak for us. Her investigators would have found whatever evidence they needed to have us arrested, and by the time the truth came out, if it ever did, we would have been long gone to prison, or worse." Emma finally found her voice. "She never cared about us when our parents were alive. She wouldn't even respond to Papa's letters asking for help when the crops failed 2 years running. But the moment she heard about valuable items going missing, suddenly she remembered she had nieces." Ezra studied the letter again, noting the calculated language and the implied threats. Margaret Whitmore was clearly a woman accustomed to getting her way, and she had the resources to make good on her promises to track down the sisters wherever they might hide. "How much time do you think we have?" Sarah asked, hard to say. "This letter was posted 6 weeks ago, and if she's hired professional trackers," Ezra folded the letter carefully, "they could be anywhere. Maybe they've already given up the search, or maybe they're closing in. No way to know for certain. The revelation changed everything in the cabin. The easy domesticity that had been developing over the past weeks was replaced by a tension that affected all of them. Sarah became more watchful, checking the approaches to the cabin frequently and insisting that they keep the rifles loaded and ready. Emma grew quieter, and Ezra often caught her staring out the windows with a worried expression. But perhaps more significantly, the threat seemed to intensify the feelings that had been developing between all three of them. Sarah, who had been gradually allowing herself to relax around Ezra, now showed a fierce protectiveness that extended to him as well as her sister. "We should leave," she said one evening, as they sat around the fire. "We've brought trouble to your door, and that's not fair to you. You didn't ask for any of this, and go where?" Ezra asked. "If they've tracked you this far, they'll find you anywhere else you try to go. At least here, on ground I know we have advantages. We, Emma asked softly. Ezra looked at her, then at Sarah, and made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. You're not alone in this anymore. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. The gratitude in both sisters' faces was almost overwhelming, but there was something else there too, something deeper and more complicated. In the days that followed, Ezra began to notice changes in how both sisters interacted with him. Sarah, who had always been somewhat formal despite their growing closeness, began to touch his arm when she spoke to him, to seek out opportunities to work beside him on daily tasks. Emma, already naturally warm, became more openly affectionate, finding excuses to be near him and looking at him with an expression. That left no doubt about her feelings. The situation came to a head one evening when Ezra returned from checking the trap lines to find both sisters working together to prepare what was clearly intended to be a special dinner. They had used some of their carefully hoarded supplies to create a meal that would have been appropriate for a celebration, and both had taken obvious care with their appearance. "What's the occasion?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. Sarah and Emma exchanged a look that spoke of prior discussion and mutual agreement. It was Emma who answered, her cheeks pink but her voice steady. "We wanted to thank you properly for everything you've done for us. And we wanted to—" She hesitated, then plunged ahead. "We wanted to tell you how we feel about you, both of us," Sarah added quietly. Ezra felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had sensed this moment coming, had seen it building in their glances and gestures and small kindnesses, but he was still unprepared for the directness of it. "Emma, Sarah, please," Sarah interrupted. "Let us say this. We know it's unusual. We know it's not what most people would consider proper, but we've talked about it, and we both feel the same way. We both care for you, and we both want to be part of your life permanently, as your wives," Emma added, her voice barely above a whisper, but her eyes never leaving his face. The silence that followed was filled with the crackle of the fire and the sound of Ezra's heart beating so loudly he was certain the sisters could hear it. He looked at these two remarkable young women who had transformed his life so completely, and realized that his answer had been forming for weeks without his conscious awareness. But before he could speak, the sound of horses approaching through the darkness outside made all of them freeze. The threat they had been dreading had finally arrived. The horses stopped just beyond the circle of light cast by the cabin windows, but Ezra could see the shapes of at least 3 riders in the darkness. He motioned for the sisters to move away from the windows while he reached for his rifle, his mind already calculating angles and cover and the tactical situation they faced. "Stone!" a voice called out from the darkness. "Ezra Stone, we know you're in there, and we know you've got the Whitmore girls with you. Send them out, and nobody has to get hurt." The voice carried an authority that spoke of someone accustomed to being obeyed. But there was something else in it, a weariness that suggested this confrontation was not entirely welcome. These were not simple bounty hunters or hired thugs. These were men with a job to do who would prefer to do it without violence. "Who's asking?" Ezra called back, keeping his rifle ready but not yet taking aim. "Name's Fletcher. I'm a federal marshal, and I've got warrants for the arrest of Sarah and Emma Whitmore on charges of theft and embezzlement. Send them out peaceful, and we'll handle this by the book." Ezra glanced at the sisters, noting Sarah's white face and the way Emma's hands trembled as she clutched her sister's arm. Whatever the truth of their situation, they were genuinely terrified of what would happen if they were taken back to face Margaret Whitmore's accusations. "Let me see those warrants," Ezra replied. "Ride up slow and keep your hands visible." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of a single horse approaching. The rider who emerged into the light was a man of perhaps 50, with grey hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent his life outdoors. He wore a marshal's badge and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a professional lawman. "Marshal Fletcher," the man said, dismounting carefully and approaching the cabin with his hands clearly visible. "I've got federal warrants here for the arrest of Sarah Jane Whitmore and Emma Rose Whitmore." He reached into his coat slowly and produced a folded document. "You're welcome to examine them." Ezra stepped onto the porch, rifle still ready, and accepted the papers. The warrants appeared genuine, bearing the proper seals and signatures. But as he read the charges listed, his suspicion grew. The accusations were too vague, too carefully worded to avoid specific details that could be easily disproven. "These charges are mighty convenient," Ezra observed. "Not much in the way of specifics." Fletcher's expression suggested he had noted the same thing. "That's not for me to judge, Stone. I've got valid warrants and I've got a job to do. But I'll tell you this, I'd prefer to handle this without any unpleasantness. You've got a reputation as a decent man, and I've got no quarrel with you. And if I refuse to hand them over, then I'll have to arrest you for obstruction of justice, and we'll take them anyway. You're outnumbered 3-1, and while I respect your capabilities, I don't see this ending well for anybody if it comes to shooting." From inside the cabin, Sarah's voice called out clearly, "Marshal Fletcher, may we speak with you?" Fletcher looked to Ezra, who nodded slowly and stepped aside. Sarah emerged from the cabin, followed closely by Emma, both sisters maintaining their composure despite their obvious fear. "Marshal," Sarah said, "before you take us back, there are some things you should know about Margaret Whitmore and the charges she's brought against us." Fletcher studied the sisters carefully, and Ezra could see the lawman's professional assessment at work. "I'm listening. Our aunt is a wealthy woman who never had much use for our family while our parents were alive," Sarah began. "When they died and left us orphaned, she saw an opportunity to claim property that legally belonged to us. The items she accuses us of stealing, our mother's jewelry, family photographs, personal effects, these were ours by right of inheritance." "That's for a court to decide," Fletcher replied. But his tone suggested he was not entirely unsympathetic. "A court where she has influence and money, and we have nothing," Emma added quietly. "Marshal, we're not criminals. We're orphaned girls who took what belonged to us and fled because we knew we'd never get justice through proper channels." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the sisters and then to Ezra. "You got any proof of what you're claiming?" Sarah reached into her dress and pulled out a folded paper, a document that looked official and well-preserved. "Our father's will. It specifically leaves all of our mother's personal effects to us, along with funds he had set aside for our future. Margaret Whitmore is trying to claim these items were part of the general estate." The marshal examined the document carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful. "This looks legitimate. Why didn't you present this to the local authorities when the accusations were first made?" "Because the local sheriff is Margaret Whitmore's brother-in-law," Sarah said bitterly. "The whole town depends on her family's business. We knew we'd never get a fair hearing." Ezra watched the exchange with growing understanding. The sisters had been telling the truth. They were not thieves, but victims of a powerful woman's greed. But he also saw something else in Fletcher's manner. A careful consideration that suggested the marshal had his own doubts about the case he had been sent to prosecute. "Marshal," Ezra said quietly, "might I have a word with you privately?" Fletcher nodded, and the two men stepped away from the cabin, out of earshot of the sisters, but still within sight of the other lawman, waiting in the darkness. "You don't believe those charges any more than I do," Ezra said. It was not a question. Fletcher sighed. "I've been a marshal for 23 years, Stone. I've learned to read people, and those girls don't read like criminals. But I've also got federal warrants signed by a judge, and I've got superiors who expect me to do my job regardless of my personal feelings. What if I told you I was planning to marry them?" The marshal's eyebrows shot up. "Both of them?" "It's not unheard of on the frontier. Plenty of men take multiple wives when circumstances warrant it. These girls need protection, and I need—" Ezra paused, realizing as he spoke that he was stating something he had not fully acknowledged even to himself. "I need them. They've brought my life back to me." Fletcher studied him carefully. "That would complicate things legally. Married women have different protections under the law, especially if their husband is a man of property and standing. Then give me time to make it legal. A few days to get down to town, find a preacher, handle the paperwork properly, and if I do that, and you all just disappear into the mountains never to be seen again, Ezra met his gaze directly, then you'll know you did the right thing. Instead of delivering two innocent girls to a woman who means them harm, the conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the darkness, angry voices and the sound of horses moving restlessly. One of Fletcher's deputies appeared at the edge of the light, his expression grim. "Marshal, we got company coming up the trail. Looks like maybe 6 or 7 riders moving fast," Fletcher cursed under his breath. "Whitmore's private men. I told her to let us handle this legally, but she never was one to trust in proper procedures when she could buy a solution." The situation had just become far more dangerous. Private security men would not be constrained by the same legal and ethical considerations that governed a federal marshal. They would be operating under instructions to retrieve the sisters by whatever means necessary, and they would not hesitate to use violence to accomplish their goal. "Marshal," Ezra said urgently, "those girls are under my protection now. I don't care what papers you're carrying or what orders you've been given. Nobody's taking them anywhere without a fight." Fletcher looked at him for a long moment, then made a decision that would change all their lives. "Deputy Morrison," he called to one of his men, "gather up those warrants and bring them here." When the papers were handed to him, Fletcher tore them methodically into small pieces and scattered them in the wind. "Looks like I lost the paperwork somewhere on the trail. Terrible thing, but it happens sometimes in rough country." Ezra stared at him in amazement. "You're willing to risk your career for 2 girls you don't even know?" "I'm willing to risk my career to make sure justice gets done instead of just law," Fletcher replied. "But if we're going to make this work, we need to move fast. Those men coming up the trail won't be deterred by missing paperwork." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching riders grew louder. Through the trees, Ezra could see the flicker of torches and the shapes of armed men moving with purpose toward his cabin. The battle for the sisters' freedom was about to begin in earnest, and Ezra realized that everything he had built in his 15 years of solitude was about to be put at risk for the sake of 2 young women who had become more precious to him than his own life. Sarah. "Emma," he called, "get inside and stay down. Marshal, I hope you're as good with that rifle as your reputation suggests." "Good enough," Fletcher replied grimly, checking his weapon. "Let's see if we can teach Margaret Whitmore's hired guns that some things can't be bought." The wanted poster that Sarah had been carrying, now crumpled and torn, fluttered away in the mountain wind, a reminder of the pursuit that had brought them all to this moment, and the violence that would determine their future. The attack came with a precision that spoke of military training rather than simple hired thugs. Ezra had expected a direct assault, the kind of clumsy charge that most men with more money than sense would organize. Instead, he found himself facing a coordinated assault from multiple directions, with covering fire and tactical movement that reminded him uncomfortably of his own military past. The first shots shattered the cabin windows simultaneously, followed immediately by the crash of the front door being kicked in. Ezra, positioned behind an overturned table with Marshal Fletcher beside him, returned fire with the steady rhythm of an experienced marksman. But even as he fought, part of his mind was analyzing the attack pattern and reaching a disturbing conclusion. "These aren't just hired guns," he called to Fletcher between shots. "Someone with real military experience is running this operation." Fletcher's response was cut off by the appearance of a figure in the doorway, a man in expensive clothes but carrying himself with the bearing of a professional soldier. What caught Ezra's attention, however, was not the man's obvious competence, but the way Sarah reacted to seeing him. "No," she whispered, her face going white as paper. "It can't be. Jacob, you're supposed to be dead." The man in the doorway lowered his rifle slightly, his own expression showing shock and something that might have been pain. "Hello, Sarah. You're looking well for a dead woman." The gunfire around them seemed to pause as both sides recognized that something significant was happening. Emma, crouched beside her sister, stared at the newcomer with confusion and growing understanding. "You know this man?" Ezra demanded, not lowering his own weapon. "He's our brother," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "Our older brother Jacob. He was supposed to have died in the war 5 years ago." Jacob Whitmore, for that was clearly who he was, stepped fully into the cabin, signaling for his men to hold their fire. He was tall and lean, with the same dark hair as Sarah, and features that clearly marked him as a member of the Whitmore family. But there was something hard in his expression, something that spoke of experiences that had changed him fundamentally. "I did die in the war," he said quietly. "At least Jacob Whitmore, the idealistic farm boy, died. What came back was something else entirely. We were told you were killed at Shiloh," Emma said, finding her voice. "Papa grieved for you every day until he died. Papa believed what he needed to believe. It was easier than accepting what I had become." Jacob's gaze moved to Ezra and Fletcher, assessing the threat they represented. "I work for Margaret now. Have for the past 3 years. She pays well for certain types of services." The betrayal in Sarah's voice was heartbreaking. "You're the one who's been hunting us. Your own sisters. My job was to find you and bring you back to face justice for what you stole. I didn't know it was you until I saw you just now." Jacob's expression suggested the revelation was as unwelcome to him as it was to his sisters. Justice? Sarah's shock was giving way to anger. Margaret Whitmore wouldn't know justice if it bit her on the— "Margaret Whitmore pays my salary," Jacob interrupted. "And she's given me specific instructions about what to do with thieves who steal from the family estate." "We didn't steal anything," Emma cried. "Those were Mama's things, left to us in Papa's will." "A will that conveniently disappeared after Papa's death," Jacob replied, "along with a substantial amount of cash that belonged to the farm's creditors." Sarah reached into her dress and pulled out the same document she had shown Marshal Fletcher. "The will didn't disappear. We took it with us because we knew Margaret would destroy it if she could. And the money, that was our dowry fund, set aside by Papa years ago." Jacob stared at the document as though it were a snake. "That's impossible. Margaret showed me the estate inventory. There was no mention of any separate bequests to you girls. Because she doctored the records," Sarah said fiercely. "She wanted everything for herself, and we were the only ones standing in her way." For the first time since entering the cabin, Jacob looked uncertain. He reached for the will, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah handed it to him. As he read, his expression changed gradually from skepticism to confusion to something approaching horror. "This is Papa's handwriting," he said slowly. "This is his signature, and it's dated just 2 months before he died, not years ago like Margaret claimed. She lied to you," Emma said gently, "just like she lied to everyone else. Jacob, we're not criminals. We're your sisters. And we've been running from our own brother because we didn't know he was still alive." The silence that followed was broken by movement outside, Jacob's men growing restless as the standoff continued. Through the broken windows, Ezra could see armed figures positioned around the cabin, waiting for orders. "Even if this is real," Jacob said finally, "I can't just walk away. Margaret Whitmore doesn't accept failure, and she has ways of making displeasure known." "If I don't bring you back, then don't go back," Sarah interrupted. "Stay here with us. We're family, Jacob. Whatever you've done, whatever you've become, you're still our brother." Jacob's laugh was bitter. "You don't understand what I've become. Sarah, the things I've done for Margaret Whitmore, the things I've had to do to survive since the war, they're not things that can be forgiven or forgotten." From her position near the wall, Sarah pulled out something small and metallic that caught the firelight. It was a pistol, compact but well-maintained, and she held it with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "Maybe not," she said quietly. "But there are things that can be left behind. Jacob, we lost you once. We're not going to lose you again to that woman's greed." The appearance of Sarah's hidden weapon changed the dynamic in the room once again. Ezra realized that there were still depths to these sisters that he had not plumbed, still secrets that had not been revealed. But more importantly, he could see the war taking place in Jacob's expression, the conflict between family loyalty and self-preservation. between the man he had been and the man circumstances had forced him to become. "There's another option," Marshal Fletcher spoke up quietly. "Margaret Whitmore hired you to retrieve stolen property. But if the property wasn't stolen, if these girls are the legal heirs to what they took, then your job is finished. Successfully." Jacob looked at him sharply. "And you are?" "Federal Marshal Tom Fletcher. And I've just determined that the warrants I was carrying for these ladies were based on false information. As far as the law is concerned, Sarah and Emma Whitmore are free to go wherever they choose. Margaret won't accept that. Margaret Whitmore doesn't have a choice in the matter. Federal law supersedes her private arrangements." Fletcher's voice carried the weight of authority. "The question is, Mr. Whitmore, are you going to continue working for a woman who sent you to hunt your own sisters based on lies, or are you going to remember who you used to be?" The sound of boots on the porch interrupted the conversation. One of Jacob's men appeared in the doorway, rifle ready. "Boss, we got more riders coming up the trail. Looks like maybe a dozen, riding hard. They're flying Margaret Whitmore's personal colors." Jacob closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, Ezra saw the decision that had been made. "She didn't trust me to finish the job. She sent backup to make sure it got done her way." "Which is?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Kill everyone and burn the cabin. Make it look like you resisted arrest and died in the gunfight. Sarah and Emma disappear permanently. The will disappears with them. And Margaret gets everything she wanted." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and through the darkness, Ezra could see the flicker of torches moving up the mountain trail. The real battle was just beginning, and now they faced not just hired guns, but a coordinated military operation designed to leave no survivors. Jacob Whitmore looked at his sisters, then at the pistol Sarah still held, then at the approaching lights that meant certain death for all of them if Margaret Whitmore's final solution was allowed to proceed. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I hope you remember how to shoot as well as Papa taught you, because we're about to find out if blood really is thicker than money." The discovery of Jacob's true identity had changed everything, but there was no time to process the emotional implications. Margaret Whitmore's final contingent was approaching fast, and from the sound of their horses and the discipline of their movement, these were not men who would be interested in negotiation or legal niceties. "How many men does she have coming?" Ezra asked Jacob as they quickly repositioned themselves around the cabin. 12, maybe 15. All ex-military, all men who've done wet work for her before. They'll have orders to kill everyone and burn everything. Jacob checked his rifle with the mechanical efficiency of a professional soldier. "She wants this whole situation to disappear permanently." Marshal Fletcher was repositioning his own men to create better defensive positions. "My deputies are good, but they're lawmen, not soldiers. We're going to be seriously outgunned." It was then that Ezra made a decision that would reveal yet another layer of his carefully hidden past. Moving to his bedroom, he pushed aside the narrow bed and pried up several loose floorboards, revealing a hidden cache that spoke of preparations made long ago for exactly this type of situation. The military medal was the first thing visible, a congressional Medal of Honor that caught the lamplight, as Ezra lifted it aside to reach the weapons beneath. But it was what lay underneath that made Jacob whistle low under his breath. A modified Spencer repeating rifle, a pair of Army Colt revolvers, and enough ammunition to sustain a lengthy siege. "Well, I'll be damned," Fletcher muttered. "Ezra Stone. I should have realized. You're the ghost of Antietam." Sarah and Emma stared at Ezra with new understanding. The Congressional Medal of Honor was not something a man earned lightly, and the nickname Fletcher had used spoke of a reputation forged in the bloodiest battles of the war. "That was a long time ago," Ezra said quietly, checking the action on the Spencer rifle. "I came to these mountains to leave that man behind. Looks like you might need him again," Jacob observed. "The ghost of Antietam against Margaret Whitmore's private army. This should be interesting." Emma moved closer to Ezra, her face showing a mixture of awe and concern. "You never told us you were a war hero." "Because I'm not," Ezra replied, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "I was a soldier who got very good at killing people. The medal doesn't change what I had to do to earn it. Right now, what you had to do to earn it might be the only thing that keeps us alive," Sarah said practically. "How do we make this work?" Ezra studied the layout of his cabin and the surrounding terrain with the tactical eye he had hoped never to use again. The cabin was well positioned defensively, built into a natural clearing with good sight lines in most directions. But it was also isolated, with no easy escape routes if they were overrun. "We have advantages," he said finally. "I know this ground better than anyone, and I've spent 15 years learning every trail, every hiding place, every tactical position within miles of here. But we also have disadvantages. We're outnumbered at least 2-1, and they'll be trying to burn us out." "What about your reputation?" Fletcher asked. "From what I've heard, the Ghost of Antietam was known for unconventional tactics." "Surely that counts for something." Ezra was quiet for a moment. Memories flooding back of battles fought and men lost, of desperate situations where survival had depended on thinking beyond conventional military doctrine. The Ghost of Antietam specialized in turning superior numbers against themselves, making the enemy's strength become their weakness. "How?" Jacob asked, genuine curiosity in his voice despite their circumstances. "By making them fight the battle I wanted to fight instead of the battle they planned to fight." Ezra moved to the window and studied the approaching torches. "They're expecting to face a hermit and 2 helpless girls. Instead, they're going to face a prepared defensive position manned by people who know exactly what they're doing." The next hour was spent in frantic preparation. Ezra's hidden cache yielded more surprises, carefully placed charges that could bring down strategic trees to block trails, oil-soaked rags that could be turned into improvised weapons, and a collection of traps and snares that could be quickly modified for use against human opponents. Jacob, despite his conflicted loyalties, threw himself into the defensive preparations with the enthusiasm of a man who had found his way back to something resembling honor. His knowledge of Margaret Whitmore's resources and tactics proved invaluable in predicting how the attack would unfold. "She'll try to surround the cabin first," he explained as they positioned ammunition and prepared defensive positions. "Then she'll demand surrender, probably offer some kind of deal that sounds reasonable but won't be honored. When that fails, they'll try to burn you out with fire arrows or torches. And if that fails," Fletcher asked, "then they'll storm the cabin directly, probably from multiple directions at once. Margaret doesn't like loose ends, and she particularly doesn't like witnesses who can testify about her methods." Sarah, meanwhile, had revealed yet another hidden skill. The small pistol she carried was only part of her preparation. She also possessed an intimate knowledge of explosives that would have been remarkable even in a military engineer. "Papa didn't just teach us to shoot," she explained as she carefully prepared improvised grenades from the supplies in Ezra's cache. "He taught us everything he thought we might need to survive on the frontier, including how to use black powder for more than just mining." Emma's contribution was different, but equally valuable. Her intuitive understanding of the natural world allowed her to predict exactly how the attackers would approach, reading signs in the forest that even Ezra's experienced eye might have missed. "They're dividing into 3 groups," she reported from her position at the east window. "One coming straight up the main trail, one circling to approach from the creek side, and one heading up the ridge to get above us." The defensive plan that emerged was both simple and sophisticated. They would allow the attackers to commit to their positions, then use Ezra's knowledge of the terrain and Jacob's understanding of military tactics to defeat them piecemeal, rather than facing them as a coordinated force. "The key is timing," Ezra explained as they made final preparations. "We let them think they're in control, let them move into positions where their numbers work against them instead of for them. Then we hit them hard and fast before they can adapt." As the torches drew closer and the sound of men moving through the forest became audible, the 5 defenders took their positions. Ezra found himself looking around at his companions, two young women who had brought love back into his life, a federal marshal who had chosen justice over law, and a brother who had chosen family over money. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I want you all to know, this is the first time in 15 years that I felt like I was fighting for something that really mattered." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "We all matter to each other now. That's what family means." Emma nodded agreement, her face showing determination despite her fear. "We survive this together, or we don't survive it at all." Jacob checked his rifle one final time. "I've spent 3 years trying to forget who I used to be. Tonight I remember." Marshal Fletcher adjusted his position behind the overturned table. "Well, if we're all going to die, at least we're going to die for the right reasons." The sound of horses stopping just beyond rifle range told them the final phase was beginning. Through the broken windows, they could see figures moving in the darkness, taking positions for the assault that would determine whether justice or money would triumph in the Colorado mountains. Ezra felt the familiar calm that had always come to him before battle, the settling of mind and body that had earned him his reputation as a soldier. But this time it was different. This time, he was not fighting for abstract concepts like duty or country. This time, he was fighting for family, for the family he had lost and the family he had found. The ghost of Antietam was about to ride again, and Margaret Whitmore's hired killers were about to discover that some battles could not be won with superior numbers and unlimited money. Some battles could only be won by people who had something worth dying for. The attack would begin at any moment, and with it, the final test of whether love and loyalty could triumph over greed and corruption in the unforgiving wilderness of the Colorado Territory. The attack began with a voice calling from the darkness. Smooth, educated, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "This is Captain Morrison, acting on behalf of Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. You are harboring fugitives from justice. Send out Sarah and Emma Whitmore, and the rest of you will be allowed to leave unharmed." Ezra recognized the tone. It was the same false reasonableness he had heard from officers who had already decided to kill everyone regardless of surrender. He positioned himself at the main window, the Spencer rifle comfortable in hands that remembered 15 years of war. "And if we refuse," he called back, "then you will be considered accomplices to theft and conspiracy, and we will take appropriate action to apprehend all involved parties." "Appropriate action," Jacob muttered from his position near the door. "That's Margaret's favorite euphemism for murder." The conversation was a formality, and everyone in the cabin knew it. But it served a purpose. It gave Emma time to study the positions of the attackers, using her uncanny ability to sense movement in the darkness. 12 men total," she whispered. 4 coming straight at us, 3 moving to flank from the creek, 3 more going for the high ground on the ridge, and 2 staying back with the horses in case they need to retreat quickly." The tactical situation was clear to Ezra's experienced eye. Morrison was competent, but not brilliant. He was using the standard approach for overwhelming a fortified position. What he did not know was that this particular position had been prepared by a man who had spent his entire military career turning standard approaches into death traps. "Sarah," Ezra said quietly, "when I give the signal, I need you to light that fuse you prepared." Sarah nodded, her hand steady on the improvised explosive device that would bring down the large pine tree positioned to block the main approach. The timing would have to be perfect, too early, and the attackers would simply go around. Too late, and they would already be in position to storm the cabin. The first shots came from the ridge, covering fire intended to keep the defenders pinned down while the main assault developed. But Ezra had anticipated this, and his return fire was devastatingly accurate. The Spencer rifle's rapid-fire capability allowed him to put multiple rounds into the muzzle flashes on the ridge before the shooters could take effective cover. "Now, Sarah," he called. The explosion was louder than any of them had expected, and the massive pine came crashing down across the main trail with earth-shaking force. 2 of Morrison's men were caught beneath it, and the remaining assault force found their primary approach completely blocked. But Morrison adapted quickly. "Fall back and regroup," he shouted. "We'll take them from the creek side." This was exactly what Ezra had hoped for. The creek approach looked easier, but it funneled the attackers into a narrow killing ground where their numbers would work against them. He moved to the east window, signaling for Fletcher and Jacob to take positions that would create a crossfire. The assault came with military precision, covering fire from the ridge position, followed by a rapid advance across the creek. But the attackers discovered too late that the ground they were crossing had been prepared with hidden traps and obstacles that turned their organized advance into chaos. Emma's grenades, thrown with surprising accuracy, exploded among the advancing men just as they reached the middle of the creek. The combination of the explosions and the difficult terrain broke their formation completely. "Take them now!" Ezra shouted, and the devastating crossfire from the cabin cut down 3 more attackers before they could reach cover. But the victory came at a cost. Return fire from the remaining attackers on the ridge found its mark, and Marshal Fletcher cried out as a bullet took him in the shoulder. Emma immediately moved to help him, her gentle nature overriding the tactical situation. "I'm all right," Fletcher gasped, but blood was spreading across his shirt. "Keep fighting!" The pattern continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Morrison's men were skilled and determined, but they were fighting on ground, chosen by their opponents, against an enemy who knew every rock and tree. Each assault was broken by carefully prepared defenses. Each flanking attempt turned into a trap, but the cabin was taking damage too. The walls were splintered by bullet holes. The windows were completely shot out, and smoke was beginning to drift in from fires the attackers had started around the perimeter. "They're trying to burn us out," Jacob observed. Noting the growing glow of flames outside, Ezra could see the wooden beam above the fireplace beginning to smolder where a fire arrow had lodged. The symbol of his carefully constructed solitary life was literally beginning to burn around him. But strangely, he felt no regret. This cabin had been a hiding place, a retreat from life. What would rise from its ashes would be something entirely different, a true home, built on love and defended by family. "Let it burn," he said grimly. "We're not staying here anyway." The next phase of Morrison's attack would be the most dangerous, a final, desperate assault using the cover of smoke and flame to get close enough to storm the cabin directly. But Ezra had one more surprise prepared. One final trap that would determine whether any of them lived to see the dawn. The final assault came with the fury of desperate men who knew they were running out of options. Morrison's remaining forces, perhaps 6 men still capable of fighting, charged through the smoke and flames in a coordinated rush that was both brave and foolish. They had not counted on Ezra's final preparation. A series of carefully placed charges that would bring down not just trees, but an entire section of the ridge above the cabin. When the attackers committed to their final charge, Ezra triggered the master fuse that Sarah had helped him prepare. The explosion was tremendous, shaking the ground and sending an avalanche of rock and debris crashing down into the clearing. 2 of Morrison's men disappeared beneath the falling stone, and the others found themselves cut off from retreat as the path behind them was completely blocked. In the sudden silence that followed the avalanche, Captain Morrison's voice could be heard calling for surrender, but this time it was his surrender he was offering. "Enough," he shouted from somewhere in the smoke. "We're done. This isn't worth dying for." But even as Morrison was ready to quit, the sound of a single horse approaching at desperate speed told them the battle was not over. Through the smoke and flames, a lone rider appeared, a woman in expensive traveling clothes. Her face twisted with rage and determination. Margaret Whitmore had come to finish the job herself. "You incompetent fools," she screamed at her surviving men. "They're just 1 man and 2 girls. How hard can it be?" But as she raised a rifle of her own, aiming directly at the cabin window where Sarah was visible, Jacob Whitmore stepped out of the burning building and into the clear space between his employer and his sisters. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly. "I think it's time we had a talk." Margaret's face went white as she realized who was standing before her. "Jacob, what are you doing? These girls are thieves. They stole from your family's estate." "No," Jacob replied, pulling the will from his coat. "They took what belonged to them. This is our father's will, Margaret. The real one. The one that proves you've been lying about everything." For a moment, Margaret Whitmore's composure cracked completely. "That's impossible. I had that document destroyed years ago. You had a copy destroyed. But Sarah was smarter than you gave her credit for. She kept the original." Jacob's voice carried a weariness that spoke of 3 years of following orders he should never have accepted. "It's over, Margaret. The girls are innocent, and everyone knows it now." Margaret's response was to raise her rifle toward Jacob instead of his sisters. "You always were weak, Jacob. Too sentimental for the kind of work that needs doing. I should have known you'd turn traitor when it mattered." The shot rang out across the clearing, but it was not Margaret Whitmore who fired it. Emma, moving with surprising speed and determination, had retrieved Ezra's pistol and put a bullet into Margaret's shoulder before the older woman could kill her brother. Margaret Whitmore fell from her horse, her rifle spinning away into the darkness. As she lay on the ground clutching her wounded shoulder, her empire of greed and corruption finally came crashing down around her. "It's finished," Marshal Fletcher said, emerging from the cabin despite his own wound. "Margaret Whitmore, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder." The surviving members of Margaret's force made no attempt to continue the fight. With their employer wounded and their mission clearly failed, they were more interested in escape than in further violence. Captain Morrison himself helped tend to Margaret's wound, his professional pride wounded, but his conscience finally clear. As dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, the full scope of the night's events became clear. The cabin was badly damaged but not destroyed, and miraculously, no one on the defenders' side had been killed. Fletcher's shoulder wound was painful but not serious, and even Margaret Whitmore would recover from her injury in time to stand trial. But perhaps the most significant change was in Jacob Whitmore himself. The man who had spent 3 years trying to forget who he used to be had finally remembered. And the reunion with his sisters carried an emotional weight that left all of them in tears. "I'm sorry," he said simply, holding both Sarah and Emma as the sun rose behind them. "I'm so sorry for everything I did, everything I became. Can you ever forgive me?" "You're our brother," Sarah replied through her tears. "There's nothing to forgive." Emma, meanwhile, had moved to Ezra's side as he surveyed the damage to his cabin and contemplated what came next. In her hand, she held something that caught the morning light, a simple ring made from a brass bullet casing. "Carefully shaped and polished. Emma made it during the battle," Sarah explained, noticing Ezra's puzzled expression. "She said if we survived, she wanted to have something ready." Emma looked up at Ezra with eyes that held all the love and determination that had carried them through the darkest night of their lives. "I know it's not much," she said softly, "but it's made from the bullet that started our new life together. Will you accept it?" As Ezra looked at this remarkable young woman who had helped save them all, he realized that his answer had been clear from the moment she first asked him about being part of a family again. The old life was truly over, burned away in the night's violence. What remained was the promise of something entirely new, a family forged in conflict and sealed with love. "Yes," he said simply, taking the ring and slipping it onto his finger. "But there's something we need to discuss first." Sarah stepped forward, understanding immediately what he meant. "About both of us wanting to marry you. About all of us wanting to be a family," Ezra corrected gently. "There are ways to make this work legally on the frontier, if that's what we all truly want." Emma smiled through her tears. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Stone?" "It's a promise," Ezra replied, looking at both sisters with eyes that held 15 years of loneliness finally coming to an end. "A promise that none of us will ever be alone again." As Marshal Fletcher organized the prisoners and Jacob Whitmore began planning his testimony against his former employer, the sun continued to rise over the Colorado mountains. The cabin could be rebuilt, the damage could be repaired, and justice would finally be served. But most importantly, three hearts that had been broken by loss and separation had found their way back together, and a new family had been born in the crucible of conflict and love. 6 months later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the rebuilt cabin as Emma chased her young nephew around the kitchen table while Sarah prepared dinner. The cabin was larger now, expanded to accommodate the family it had become, and the charred beams from the night of the battle had been replaced with strong new timber that spoke of permanence and hope. Ezra stood in the doorway, watching his wives, for that was what they had, become in a ceremony conducted by a traveling preacher who asked no awkward questions about frontier marriages and marveled at how completely his life had been transformed. The solitary man who had once treasured silence above, all else now found his greatest joy in the constant gentle noise of a home filled with love. The legal complexities had been resolved more easily than any of them had expected. Margaret Whitmore's trial had revealed the full extent of her fraudulent schemes, and the Whitmore sisters had been awarded not only their rightful inheritance, but substantial damages as well. The money meant security and choices they had never expected to have. But perhaps more importantly, Jacob's testimony had cleared their names completely and established him as a hero rather than a villain. His years working for Margaret Whitmore had given him intimate knowledge of her criminal enterprises, and his cooperation with federal authorities had helped bring down an entire network of corruption that had been operating throughout the Colorado Territory. On the mantelpiece above the new fireplace, 3 wooden crosses still stood in their place of honor, but they were no longer alone. Beside them sat a family Bible that had belonged to Sarah and Emma's parents, open to the page where Ezra had carefully recorded 3 marriages: Ezra Stone to Sarah Jane Whitmore, Ezra Stone to Emma Rose Whitmore, and most recently, Jacob Samuel Whitmore to Mary Catherine Murphy, the daughter of the trader who had delivered that fateful letter so many months ago. The arrangement had raised eyebrows in town, but on the frontier, practical considerations often outweighed social conventions. 2 sisters who had inherited substantial property needed the protection and partnership of a good man, and a man who had spent 15 years alone needed the warmth and companionship that only a loving family could provide. The law recognized the marriages. The church had blessed them, and the community had accepted them as a practical solution to everyone's needs. More than that, it worked. Sarah's practical nature and head for business had turned their mountain property into a profitable operation that provided not only for their needs, but for those of several families in the surrounding area. Emma's intuitive understanding of the land had led to the discovery of a silver vein that promised prosperity for years to come. And Ezra's experience and reputation provided the security and respect that allowed them to live without fear. The children had come as naturally as spring follows winter. Sarah's son Thomas, named for the boy Ezra had lost so many years ago, was now 4 months old, and showing signs of inheriting his mother's determination and his father's steady temperament. Emma was expecting their first child in the spring, and the glow of impending motherhood had only enhanced her natural radiance. Jacob, meanwhile, had found his own path to redemption. His marriage to Mary Murphy had been a love match from the first moment they met, and his transition from Margaret Whitmore's enforcer to a respected member of the community had been remarkably smooth. His military experience made him a natural choice for sheriff when the previous office holder retired, and his intimate knowledge of criminal operations had made him remarkably effective at maintaining law and order. The evening routine had become one of Ezra's favorite times. After dinner, they would gather around the fireplace, the adults in comfortable chairs, the children playing on the rug, and share the events of their day. Sometimes Sarah would read aloud from one of their books. Sometimes Emma would sing the gentle songs her mother had taught her. And sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence and watch the fire burn down to embers. "Do you ever miss it?" Emma asked one evening as they sat together after the others had gone to bed. "The solitude, I mean. The simplicity of your old life." Ezra considered the question seriously, as he always did when Emma asked him something important. "I miss the peace of it sometimes," he admitted. "The certainty of knowing exactly what each day would bring. But I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything. This—" He gestured around the room, encompassing not just the physical space, but everything it represented. "This is what I was meant to have all along. I just had to lose it once to understand how precious it was." Sarah, emerging from the bedroom where she had been checking on baby Thomas, caught the end of the conversation. "And what about us?" she asked, settling into her chair beside the fire. "Do you think we made the right choice? Sharing a husband instead of each finding our own?" "I think," Ezra said carefully, "that love doesn't always follow the patterns that society expects. What we have works because we all chose it freely, and because we all contribute something essential to making it work. Thomas will grow up in a house filled with love and security, and so will Emma's child. They'll have parents who chose to be together because they wanted to be, not because convention demanded it. Besides," Emma added with a mischievous smile, "can you imagine either of us trying to manage you alone? You're far too stubborn for one woman to handle." The gentle teasing that followed was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Jacob entered, carrying his sleeping daughter Catherine, with Mary close behind. "Just wanted to say good night," he said softly, "and to thank you again for everything you've done for our family." "We are family," Ezra replied simply. "All of us. That's what matters." As the evening wound down and the house settled into the peaceful quiet of night, Ezra found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The pain of loss that had driven him to the mountains, the loneliness that had nearly consumed him, the fear that had almost prevented him from opening his heart again. All of it had been necessary to bring him to this place. This time, these people who had become his whole world, outside. The Colorado winter was beginning to tighten its grip on the mountain, but inside the cabin, warmth and love created a sanctuary that no storm could threaten. The man who had once believed that solitude was safety had learned that the greatest security came from being surrounded by people who would fight for you, live for you, and love you without reservation. The family Bible remained open on the mantelpiece, its pages recording not just the marriages and births that had created this new family, but the promise of all the entries yet to be written. This was no longer just a house in the mountains, it was a home, filled with the laughter of children and the quiet satisfaction of adults who had found exactly where they belonged. Sometimes the kindest heart really did beat in the loneliest chest. But when that heart finally found its home, the love it created could warm a family for generations to come.